Hey guys, thanks for joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back, or welcome if it's your first time on our podcast. Our episode today is going to cover five of the closest presidential races in U.S. history. We've got a very tight race that's going to be decided this Tuesday, and there's a lot of talk about how fractured the country is and how there's underhanded tactics being employed, et cetera, et cetera. And that talk really makes it sound like this has never happened in our history before. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we're going to give you five examples where things got spicy, things got downright illegal, or were super dirty, or at least had the appearance of not being above board. So let's dive into it from there. First one is in 1824. The winner of that election was John Quincy Adams. There were two parties in the country at the time, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party was going to nominate and run Alexander Hamilton, but he was killed in a duel by Aaron Burr. So Hamilton's gone. They don't have a strong second to nominate, and it really should have been easy for the Democratic Republicans to take over the presidency without much trouble. Well, they screwed it up. So there was no national convention at this point, and they all couldn't agree on a candidate. So they actually ran four different candidates for president that year on one ticket. So there was an election. The the Federalist Party got almost no support, but the Democratic Republicans fractured their vote across four candidates. Andrew Jackson received more Electoral College votes than anybody. And then John Quincy Adams came in second. Third and fourth were two guys that didn't factor much into, except Henry Clay got some votes. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It's important to note that Henry Clay was one of the people that ran for president and finished a distant fourth. So the Constitution says that if you don't get a majority of the Electoral College votes at that point, it was 131 votes. He only got 99, so I got kicked to the House of Representatives for decision. And also important to note that at this point in the country, the election was in November, but we didn't actually inaugurate the president, the new president, until March. Now it happens January 20th, but back then it went all the way to March. And so they had some time. And so there was several months in the U.S. Senate, or U.S. House of Representatives, I'm sorry, that there was horse trading, there was back office dealing, there was you do this, I'll do that, you do that, I'll support your guy, et cetera, et cetera. But the real linchpin of what really handed the election to John Quincy Adams was when Henry Clay, who ran but finished a distant fourth, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams instead of Andrew Jackson, which his home state of Kentucky wanted to support Jackson, but Clay made the decision on his own to support John Quincy Adams, which essentially handed him the presidency. Jackson was furious. He did not like John Quincy Adams. They dueled and feuded for the rest of their lives. Jackson wound up winning the presidency after John Quincy Adams was president and wound up becoming our seventh president. But that election in 1824 was hotly contested, pretty slimy, with backroom dealings going on in the House of Representatives to hand the election to John Quincy Adams. So that is the first election. Next election we're going to look at came about a century later in 1916. So Woodrow Wilson was the president and he was running for re-election. Important to note, the biggest reason Woodrow Wilson won in 1912 when he became president for the first time was Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president previously, decided not to run for a third term. He was honoring the long-standing tradition that was set by George Washington, who also declined to run for a third term of president because he was concerned about being viewed as a king-like person or a king-like figure. And we had just fought a war to get rid of monarch rule. And Washington didn't want to create the perception that he was becoming a monarch or the king of the United States. So he did not run for a third term. Roosevelt said, I'm going to honor that and not run. Well, so then in 1912, he decided that happened in 1908. And then in 1912, he decided to run again. And William Howard Taft was the president in 1908, from 1908 to 1912. Roosevelt runs again in 1912, but the Republicans don't want to knock back a sitting president. So Roosevelt starts his own party called the Bull Moose Party. He's run as a progressive. And essentially what he did was siphoned off a ton of support from the Republican Party and handed the election to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. So that's how he got elected. Now, you've got, fast forward to 1916, you've got a fractured Republican Party, you've got a sitting president running for re-election. So the Republicans decided to nominate a guy named Charles Evans Hughes. Was a popular political figure in New York. He was also a Supreme Court justice at the time. So he resigned from the Supreme Court to run for president. Well, at this point in the country, one of the battleground states was California. And so Hughes needed to drum up support in California to win California if he was going to win the presidency. Well, there were two guys that were running for the Senate in California that year. One was a guy named Hiram Johnson, and the other one was a guy named William Booth. Johnson was more of a progressive, and Booth was more of a conservative. So it was important to Hughes to kind of keep both these guys happy because he needed their support to drum up votes in California to win California. So Hughes goes out to California just a few months before the election, and he was in Long Beach. He was staying at a hotel, and he was staying in the same hotel that Johnson was staying at or was visiting. Hughes says he didn't know that Johnson was there, so Hughes never reached out to him, never offered him a drink, never said, let's meet for a meal, didn't do anything. Well, Johnson gets pissed, thinks he's being snubbed, and refuses to campaign for Hughes in California because he was snubbed by Hughes. So the election happens, and it winds up being an incredibly tight race in California. So Wilson in California received 456,936 votes. Hughes got 462,516 votes, a difference of 3,420 votes, 0.34% of all the votes cast in California. So California at that point had 13 electoral votes, and those 13 electoral votes going to Wilson instead of Hughes made the difference. Wilson won the Electoral College with 277 electoral votes, and Hughes had 254. If you flip those 13, Hughes would have been president, and Wilson would have been defeated. But that's not what happened. But it was so close that the Hughes campaign was convinced there had to be some impropriety, and they were going to look for votes. So they hired lawyers. They started to try to dig up evidence to argue that there was a recount necessary or there was some type of impropriety. Ultimately, they found nothing and said, we gotta walk away. We can't find anything that's compelling here. But 3,000 votes in California decided the presidency that year, or we would have had a different president than Woodrow Wilson during World War I. So that was a very interesting, hotly contested election where the loser hired attorneys, looked for improprieties, and clouded kind of the victory of Wilson for a period of time. Okay, so there's two of them. Next, 1884, the winner of that election was Grover Cleveland. So it was actually even closer than 1916. This one's kind of crazy. So the swing state this time was New York. This was in 1884. New York was a swing state at that point in our history. So it had 36 electoral votes. So it was big. There was a lot of people there. And if you could win New York, it was going to go a long way towards helping you win the presidency. Well, Cleveland was a very popular Democrat candidate from New York, and he had gained notoriety by busting up and campaigning against Tammany Hall, which was the corrupt Boss Tweed organization in New York. So the Democrats basically had a vice grip at this point. 1884 is post-Civil War. The Democrats, I know it's not popular to say, but the Democrats were the party of segregation. They suppressed the black vote, and they held a death grip on the southern states. So they knew they were going to win all those states. They were not swing states in any way, shape, or form. They were deep blue states at that point in our country. So Cleveland, who's from New York, was the governor of New York. All he's got to do is win New York, and he's essentially assured of the presidency. Well, enter the sexual scandal. So Cleveland was accused of fathering a child out of wedlock with a woman and then abandoning the woman. And Cleveland had built this reputation of being kind of morally impeccable. So he busts up corruption. He's a do-gooder. He's got the people's best interest in mind. In 1884, you knock a lady up and you run away. It's not real well thought of. So he doesn't deny the accusations because it sounds like he probably did what they were accusing him of doing. And so the race in New York was incredibly close. So Cleveland received 563,048 votes in New York, and his competitor, Blaine, received 562,001. So that's 1,047 votes difference, or 0.09% of all the votes cast in the state. So, with New York's 36 electoral votes, Cleveland defeated Blaine at 219 electoral college votes to 182. But good old fashioned sex scandal, even in 1884, almost tipped the scales of the country's history. So, 1876, let's move on to that election. The winner of that election was Rutherford B. Hayes. And this one gets really ugly. Now remember, this is 1876. This is 12 years after the end of the Civil War, 11 years after the end of the Civil War. So one of the goals at this point was to really kind of protect and restore black votes, black voting rights, because they were absolutely being suppressed in the South, 100% for sure. I mean, there was like terrorist actions going on where people were being physically harmed, threatened. It was bad. So Reconstruction, which was supposed to be the reintegration of the South into the North and becoming one country again, was pretty much dead. We're suppressing black votes in the South, so the Democrats kind of own the South at this point, except the Republicans fought back, and they fought dirty. So you've got one side that's disenfranchising a big segment of the U.S. population, and the Republicans said, hey, you can't do these things. This is wrong. You can't suppress the vote. You can't not count votes. We call bullshit. And so they contested after the voting was done. They contested and demanded recounts in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. But they don't just ask for a recount. They essentially planted their own people inside these recounts and kind of rigged them, to be straightforward. Florida was the most egregious, and they had a little bit of power in the office of the governor and the Secretary of State, and so they manipulated the counting of the ballots in Florida. And by almost every person who looks at it says if they had actually recounted the ballots fairly in Florida, the Democrats would have won that. But the Republican ringers that they put in place in Florida declared Rutherford B. Hayes the winner. So that wasn't good enough for the Democrats. The Attorney General in Florida was a Democrat at the time, and he came up with his own recount. And he declared Samuel Tilden, who was Rutherford B. Hayes' opponent, the state's winner. And the Constitution doesn't really say anything what to do when the state itself is contesting its own electoral college votes. So they kicked this thing to Congress and asked them to come up with a solution. Congress came up with this 15-person panel. It was supposed to be bipartisan, 7 congressmen from one party, 7 congressmen from another party, and then there was a Supreme Court justice, so it made 15, an odd number of people, and they called it the Electoral Commission. This 15-person commission decided by one vote, 8-7, to give the presidency to Hayes and the Republicans by one vote. Now, the way the math worked out, that actually handed the presidency in the Electoral College to Hayes by one vote. He defeated Samuel Tilden 185 electoral votes to 184 electoral votes. So that still remains to this day, because it doesn't get closer than one vote. That is the closest Electoral College victory in U.S. history. But you got both sides doing absolutely crooked shit. You got both sides absolutely cheating and lying and doing whatever they can to win that election. And this was 1876. This was 150 years ago. It was post-Civil War. There was all sorts of problems with the country at that point. Very difficult to dispute that was not one of the most tumultuous and difficult times in our country's history. We got through it okay, even with all the underhanded bullshit that went on during this election. So this is nothing new. What we're experiencing now is nothing new. Don't let the doom and gloom forecasts fool you. We're going to be okay. As long as we stick together, we're going to be okay. So let's go to the 2000 election. That's the last one that we're going to cover. We'll do a little bonus commentary on the 1960 election, but the last election we're going to cover in detail was 2000, and the winner of that was George H.W. Bush. Now, a lot of us were alive. I know I was alive. and a voter and remember that election. So the candidates were Al Gore, who was the sitting vice president, and George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas at the time, and obviously the son of a former president. So that race was hotly contested from start to finish, and kind of everyone knew it was going to come down to Florida, where George Bush's brother happened to be the governor. Jeb Bush happened to be the governor of Florida at the time. And Florida had 25 electoral votes, and whoever won that state, because of the way the other states were going to play out based on polling, was going to win the election. So Bush builds up a pretty good lead on election night. It looks like he can't be caught. Gore calls him and concedes. The race tightens up after that, and Gore calls him back and says, I rescind my concession. I'm not conceding the election. So I found it interesting when I was researching this that there's a term that lawyers use and say, are the election results within the margin of litigation? Meaning, is it close enough that it's worth fighting because we might have a chance to win this thing if we have the courts rule in our favor? So Gore's lawyer said, yeah, his lead in Florida was definitely within the margin of litigation. It's worth fighting over. So they did. So after Gore rescinded his concession, the first thing the courts did was order an electronic recount. Gore's team said, no, we think there was confusion on the ballots and some people accidentally didn't vote for me that should have or wanted to, and we want a hand recount done. It's a slow and painstaking process, and you literally had people looking at ballots to say, hey, there's a dimple in, so that little thing that you punch out of a paper ballot, it's called a chad. For those of us that were around, remember the term hanging chad. So if the chad was on the ballot still, it was hanging, and if it's fed through an electronic machine, sometimes the machine wouldn't register it as a vote, was the argument. And I wasn't there. I don't know how it works. I just remember the argument, and we researched it and found all this stuff. So there's wrangling back and forth. The Bush team says, no, you can't just count them however you want. You can't just hand count where you selectively want to hand count. The Gore team said, yes, we can. So that legal fight went all the way to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court handed down a couple of rulings. First, the Florida recount, the way it was being handled, was deemed unconstitutional. And I'm not an attorney. I didn't stay at the Holiday Inn Express last night. I'm not in a position to argue the merits of that one way or another. I don't know enough about election law or those processes to say one way or the other whether that was a good ruling or not. I'm sure that if you ask a Republican, they think it was great. If you ask a Democrat, they think it was cheating and underhanded and corrupt. But that's what happened. And then the second ruling they handed down was Gore's team was done with challenges. He had to accept the results of the election. They said, George Bush is president. He won it. You're out. He's in, period. So the minority side on the Supreme Court wanted to hand it back to Florida and say, you got to fix your mess here, fix your recount process, fix your election process. Once you're done, tell us who won the election. But that's not what happened. The majority said, nope, time's up. It's over. Bush is president. Gore loses. So on the last recount, the official count of ballots in this election, Bush received 2,912,790 votes. Gore received 2,912,253 votes. So there's almost 6 million votes cast, and the difference between the two candidates in Florida was 537. So it was 0.009% of the total votes cast in Florida. That was the difference between Bush and Gore. That was the difference between Bush becoming president or Gore becoming president. So super tight, hotly contested, a lot of legal wrangling, a lot of insinuations and name calling and accusations. And that was 20 years ago, 24 years ago. So again, we're here. We've made it. We're going to be okay. Don't listen to all these doom and gloom forecasts that you hear out there. Last one we'll talk about was the 1960 election. So Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, and he ran for president against John F. Kennedy. Kennedy wins the election, but there were pretty large-scale accusations that in Illinois, in particular, there were votes counted by people who were dead years before the election. And so Nixon's team dug into it, and they felt like there was enough information there to challenge the results of the election. It was a very close election. Kennedy was barely elected president. And if Nixon had been able to flip Illinois, he would have been elected president. Obviously, he became president later on. Watergate scandal happens. He's the only president to have resigned the office. So, but starting in 1960, Nixon felt like he had a very valid claim to overturn these results in Illinois and that he might have won the state of Illinois and was actually elected president in 1960. Eisenhower called Nixon and said, hey, for the good of the country, you got to let this go. It's not going to do the country any good for us to drag this fight out. To be the bigger man, you need to step away and just accept the results as they are, which to his credit, Nixon did. And then came back and won the election in 1968. I think it was Barry Goldwater he beat the first time because LBJ decided not to run for re-election because he was mired in the Vietnam War and did not think he had the support, et cetera, et cetera. So Nixon wound up being president, and then Watergate happened, and you know how that plays out. So, yeah, there's 5 elections that we covered in detail with a little bonus commentary on a 6th election. When you think about the number of presidential elections over, what is it, over a 250-year period, what is that? About 70, 60 elections? 60 elections, somewhere in there. So we've given you 10% of them that have been hotly contested. Allegations of fraud, of illegality, of underhanded dealings, all sorts of stuff has happened throughout the history of our country. So don't worry too much about it. It's just a presidential election. Whoever winds up in the office, they wind up there. Like, your life's going to go on. Don't sweat it too much. So I really enjoyed putting this episode together. We thought the timing of it was very appropriate with the election happening tomorrow. And we really appreciate you guys coming back and checking out our channel. Don't forget, James puts all the information up over here. Don't forget to head over to our website, saltygingertalk.com. We've got links to all of our social media accounts there. You can sign up for our weekday newsletter that we publish every weekday there. And we've got episodes of all of our podcasts available there as well. And also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on our podcasts on whatever platform you consume your podcasts from. We really appreciate you guys coming back and supporting us. Great to have you here. Hope to see you in the future. Everybody have a good week, and we will see you next time.